Case 1. Corey Richins. On March 4, 2022, a mother of 3 was accused of ending the life of her own husband in a way that will later shock investigators and the public alike. Several hours after her husband's death, she placed a 911 call claiming she had woken to find him unresponsive at the foot of their bedroom floor. Corey Richins was 31 years old when the crime was committed. Eric Richins, Corey's husband of years and the father of her 3 young sons, died that night inside a home where he had no reason to feel anything but safe. From the many disturbing cases we will talk about in this documentary, we are starting with this one because it was carefully planned, and because of the public role Corey chose to play after her husband's death, which made this case very different from anything Utah courts had seen before. What led a wife and mother to make this irreversible decision? Let's get into the full story. There's a kind of grief that performs itself. It speaks softly in interviews. It chooses its words with care. It finds in the months after a devastating loss something creative to do with the pain, something shareable, something that can be handed to another grieving parent as an act of solidarity. Corey and Eric Richins lived near Park City, Utah, raising 3 young sons. Both moved in real estate circles. Eric in business and property dealings, Corey in investments and home flipping ventures. The image they presented to the world around them was one of ambition and forward momentum in an affluent mountain community. Financial records presented at trial told a different story. Prosecutors introduced evidence of debts that had grown into the millions. Forensic accounting testimony described liabilities exceeding $7 million at certain points. Corey had pursued significant property acquisitions, reportedly over Eric's objections. Friends and family testified to deepening fractures in the marriage. Eric had reportedly begun consulting divorce attorneys. He was looking for a legal path toward separation. What prosecutors argued was that Corey had settled on a path that did not require attorneys. The state's theory of motive pointed to 2 converging pressures. Eric carried life insurance policies totaling more than $2 million. Prosecutors alleged Corey had forged at least one of those applications in the months leading up to his death. Alongside the financial component was a personal one. Digital communications recovered during investigation documented a romantic relationship between Corey and a household handyman named Robert Josh Grossman. Their messages included discussions of a shared future. That future, in the prosecution's framing, required Eric's absence from the picture. Friends testified to the ongoing tensions in the household. The combination of mounting debt, alleged romantic involvement, and a life insurance payout worth more than $2 million formed what prosecutors called a motive with no missing pieces. In the early hours of March 4, 2022, Eric Richins died in the bedroom of the family's home. Toxicology confirmed a fatal fentanyl overdose. The concentration detected in his system was roughly 5 times what experts described as a lethal dose. Eric had no history of drug use. No other substance was found. No underlying medical condition explained what toxicology revealed. Corey told investigators she had woken to check on one of their sons following a nightmare. She said she discovered Eric unresponsive near the foot of the bed and called for emergency help. He was pronounced dead at the scene. Prosecutors argued the fatal evening had begun much earlier, with a drink Corey had prepared for him inside their home. The case included an earlier incident that became central to the attempted murder charge. On Valentine's Day 2022, Eric fell ill after eating a meal Corey had brought him from a local restaurant. He broke out in hives and required an emergency injection to recover. Friends and family gave testimony about that day and what followed. Prosecutors alleged the meal had been tampered with before he received it. What assembled across weeks of testimony was a portrait of someone who had allegedly tried once, met an obstacle, and tried again, successfully, the second time. The drug itself, prosecutors argued, arrived through a small informal network. Curry's housekeeper, Carmen Lauber, testified she had purchased pills from a street dealer at a gas station on multiple occasions before and after Eric's death. Lauber told the court that Curry had repeatedly asked her to procure powerful narcotics, using language that indicated she knew precisely what she was seeking. The dealer, Robert Crozier, also took the stand. His account contained inconsistencies the defense exploited during cross-examination. No witness had been in the bedroom that night. The prosecution built its entire case on forensic results, financial records, digital communications, and a behavioral pattern, including the book Curry published the following year. Are You With Me? Was available in bookstores by 2023. Curry promoted it publicly. She gave interviews about grief. She described helping her sons process their father's absence. Prosecutors showed the jury footage of those appearances. They argued the book was not the work of a grieving widow. It was, in their framing, an active performance of innocence maintained while evidence mounted around her. The defense challenged the case's circumstantial architecture at every turn. They emphasized the absence of direct eyewitness testimony. They questioned the reliability of Lauber and Crozier. They argued the jury could not cross the threshold of reasonable doubt on what the state had presented. The jury deliberated approximately 3 hours. They returned guilty verdicts on every count: aggravated murder, attempted aggravated murder, insurance fraud, and forgery. Curry Richens bowed her head as each verdict was read aloud. She was 35 at the time. Sentencing was set for May 13th, which was, by no coincidence, Eric's birthday. She faced 25 years to life in a Utah prison. Eric Richens left behind 3 sons who were in that house the night their father died. They were young enough to need a picture book to understand what loss meant. Their mother wrote that book for them and promoted it publicly, while allegedly possessing knowledge about their father's death that she never disclosed. What those boys will carry into their adult years belongs to them alone. What 12 jurors concluded in March 2026 belongs to the public record. The woman on the back cover of that children's book is now incarcerated in a Utah correctional facility. The book still exists. The man it was supposedly written to honor does not. Case 2. Megan Huntsman. Between 1996 and 2006, a woman in Pleasant Grove, Utah, secretly gave birth 7 times inside the home she shared with her long-term partner, and took the life of 6 of those newborns within moments of each delivery, hiding each child's remains in the family garage, where they stayed undiscovered for nearly 2 decades. Megan Huntsman was between 21 and 31 years old during the years these events unfolded. Waiting in separate boxes on the shelves of that garage were 6 infants, 5 girls and 1 boy, who never drew a single breath outside those walls. This case represents the longest sustained pattern of harm in this entire documentary. Hidden, repeated, and undiscovered for nearly 20 years inside an ordinary family home. To understand how this stayed buried for so long, let's uncover the full story. Megan Huntsman was born on February 26, 1975, in Pleasant Grove. She grew up as the oldest child in a working-class household and entered a long-term relationship with Darren West. Together, they had 3 daughters who survived into adulthood. The life the two built was not a stable one. Both struggled with severe addiction. Methamphetamine and alcohol shaped large stretches of their shared years, creating a particular brand of household chaos where things can exist unnoticed for far longer than they should. That instability formed the backdrop against which a pattern unfolded that neither West nor anyone outside the home detected across nearly a decade. Between 1996 and 2006, Megan Huntsman became pregnant at least 7 times. She concealed every one of those pregnancies from West, from family, from friends, and from any medical provider. No prenatal care, no documentation, no acknowledgement that the pregnancies existed at all. 1 infant was stillborn. The remaining 6 were born alive. Huntsman acknowledged in statements to police and in court that she ended each of those 6 lives shortly after birth, alone, without assistance. She then wrapped each child's remains, placed them in containers, and stored them in the garage of the family home. The bodies remained there for years, in some cases nearly 2 decades, as ordinary household life continued around them. Huntsman's own account of her reasoning, delivered through her attorney at sentencing, was one that courts rarely hear stated with such directness. She said she believed, in the moments after each birth, that she was sparing the infants from the life she knew she would provide, a life shaped by addiction, and a household she described as barely functional. She characterized herself as too consumed by her addiction to care adequately for additional children. Whether that framing amounts to genuine psychological rupture, elaborate rationalization, or some painful combination of the two is something that psychiatrists and observers have never agreed on. What she acknowledged in court was the act itself, without contest, 6 times over. Darren West, whose DNA testing would later confirm his paternity of all 7 infants, told investigators he had been entirely unaware of the pregnancies or what had happened. Police searched his background thoroughly and found no evidence of involvement. Investigators ultimately concluded that his own sustained drug use during those years may have impaired his capacity to notice what was unfolding in his own household. He was never charged as an accomplice. Some who covered the case found that conclusion deeply uncomfortable. Others argued that the depth of addiction on both sides made his ignorance possible, if not easy to accept. West discovered the first set of remains in April 2014 while cleaning out the garage following their separation. He contacted authorities immediately. Police arrived, searched the space further, and found the additional boxes. Huntsman was arrested and held on $6 million bail. She cooperated with investigators, providing details that aligned with what forensic examination later confirmed. Autopsies determined the infants had been full-term at birth. DNA testing confirmed West as the biological father of all 7. Investigators identified 5 girls and 2 boys, including the one who was stillborn. She was charged with 6 counts of first-degree felony murder. On February 12, 2015, she entered guilty pleas on all 6 counts. The sentencing hearing in April 2015, before Judge Daryl McDade in Provo, lasted hours and was described by those present as among the most difficult proceedings the courthouse had hosted. Prosecutors characterized her actions as demonstrating a profound indifference to human life sustained across an entire decade. 2 of her surviving adult daughters submitted letters expressing support for their mother. Huntsman's voice fractured as she entered her pleas. Judge McDade, departing upward from what the plea agreement had recommended, ordered 3 life terms served consecutively and 3 concurrently, citing what he described as the profound indifference each individual act represented. He stated openly on the record that the case was among the hardest he had presided over. Huntsman was not sentenced to death. Utah statutes, as they applied to crimes committed between 1996 and 2006, provided for 5 years to life on each qualifying count, and the plea structure shaped the remaining sentencing options accordingly. She is incarcerated at the Utah State Correctional Facility. Her first parole eligibility hearing is scheduled for 2064. She will be 89 years old. The 3 daughters who grew up in that Pleasant Grove home are adults now. They gave letters at sentencing. What they know about those years, what they remember, what they have since pieced together, belongs to them, and no account from the outside can fully name. 6 lives were lived only in the dark of a garage. They deserve at the very least the acknowledgement that they existed. Case 3. Victoria Mendoza. On the morning of October 18, 2014, Victoria Mendoza suddenly attacked her girlfriend while they were driving on Interstate 15 in Utah. As the car continued down the highway, the assault became so violent and relentless that by the time the vehicle finally came to a stop, her girlfriend of 5 years was dead. Victoria Mendoza was 22 years old when the crime was committed. Tawny Marie Baird, Victoria's girlfriend of 5 years, was 21. The same young woman who had once voluntarily taken a legal consequence that was never hers to bear, purely to protect the people around her. She was the one who had been behind the wheel that night. This case strips intimate partner violence down to its most unfiltered and unscripted form. No elaborate planning, no stage cover story, just 5 years of compounding volatility reaching its final, irreversible point on a Utah highway in the early hours of the morning. What led to this moment wasn't sudden. It had been building for a very long time. Let's take a closer look at how it all unfolded. The place where Victoria Mendoza and Tawny Baird first met was not a school hallway or a neighborhood park. It was a behavioral health treatment facility in Utah, where both were teenagers navigating circumstances that most people their age were nowhere near. Tawny was 17. She had stepped forward to take responsibility for a marijuana charge during a traffic stop, reportedly to shield older companions from consequence, and found herself placed in the program as a result. Victoria was there too, carrying her own particular weight. Her mother had been diagnosed with cancer, and the future felt uncertain in ways that few teenagers are ever asked to confront. Their friendship formed inside those walls, turned romantic shortly after their release, and grew into the kind of relationship that people around them would later describe as intense, complicated, and increasingly difficult to be near. Victoria and Tawny's relationship lasted approximately 5 years, and nearly everyone close to them during that time described it in similar terms. Two people who clearly cared about each other, and who brought out something volatile in one another that neither seemed able to step back from. Jealousy was a recurring feature. Controlling behavior showed up on both sides, though prosecutors and the weight of the evidence would eventually paint a picture in which Mendoza's insecurity drove much of the dynamic. She was reportedly troubled by Tawny's outgoing personality, her wide social circle, and her history with men, and those anxieties surfaced repeatedly in arguments that escalated to physical confrontations. Friends described instances of manipulation on Mendoza's part. One account detailed her initiating infidelity as a way of preemptively managing her own fear of abandonment. Breakups happened. Apologies followed, including, at one point, a video posted publicly online. The cycle continued regardless. Victoria's mother died of cancer in 2012, 2 years into the relationship. The Baird family, recognizing Mendoza's grief, opened their home to her. They allowed her to move in during that painful period and helped her secure employment. It was a generous act from a family that had accepted their daughter's partner and was trying to offer something steady. What they did not fully recognize at the time was that the relationship already had a history of physical harm serious enough to conceal from the people closest to it. In one documented incident, Mendoza struck Tawny in the face hard enough to knock out a tooth. The two women offered the family an alternative explanation for the injury. The Bairds would say later, with a kind of grief that only hindsight produces, that they had not understood the danger their daughter had been living in. By late 2014, Tawny had reportedly reached a breaking point. The years of conflict, the cycles of rupture and reconciliation, and the toll of sustained tension had led her to express a clear desire to separate and end the relationship. For Mendoza, whose fear of abandonment had been a thread running through nearly every serious conflict the two had experienced, that desire registered not as a decision she needed to respect, but as a threat she could not process. On the night of October 17th going into the 18th, the couple had visited a friend in Ogden, Utah. Toxicology would later confirm that both women had recently used marijuana. The drive back along Interstate 15 began with tension already in the air. An argument broke out, reportedly involving jealousy and Tawny's stated intention to end things once and for all. Tawny was behind the wheel. Mendoza was in the passenger seat. What followed unfolded in a matter of moments, according to Mendoza's own later account, and she would describe it afterward as explosive, uncontrolled, and disconnected from deliberate thought. The evidence that investigators collected at the scene told a story that was harder to absorb cleanly under that framing. Mendoza produced a 4-inch folding knife she routinely carried and launched a sustained assault on Tawny while the vehicle was in motion or shortly after it stopped. The medical examiner's findings described what occurred as, in their own words, fairly rageful, not a single decisive act, but a prolonged series of strikes. Tawny sustained 46 separate wounds, concentrated on the right side of her body. None of the individual injuries proved immediately fatal on its own. Death came from the cumulative consequence, blood loss and shock, progressively, while the two of them were still in that vehicle on the side of the interstate in the early morning dark. Blood evidence on the dashboard and within the car indicated that Tawny moved or was moved from the driver's seat during or after the assault. Mendoza took the wheel and drove to a church parking lot in West Ogden, one the sisters had attended as children growing up. She positioned Tawny in the passenger seat. Then she made phone calls. She contacted friends and admitted what had happened in at least one recorded conversation, saying she had felt suffocated and that she was sorry but did not know what else she could have done. She called her sister, Cindy Spencer, and asked her to come to the parking lot. Spencer arrived to find Tawny dead in the blood-covered vehicle. She contacted the authorities. When officers arrived, Mendoza was present at the scene. She was cooperative, taken into custody, and confessed, framing the attack as impulsive and directly tied to the argument that had overtaken the drive home. She was 22 years old. The legal proceedings that followed contained notable tension before their resolution. At a preliminary hearing in February 2015, Mendoza entered a not guilty plea, became visibly distressed in the courtroom, and made statements about taking her own life that led to her removal from a room. A psychological evaluation was ordered. She was found competent to proceed. The defense explored a battered woman syndrome argument, drawing on testimony from Mendoza's sister about violence, having moved in both directions across the relationship. The physical evidence, however, showed injuries concentrated on Tawny's body rather than Mendoza's, a finding that significantly undermined the idea of Tawny as the primary aggressor. The Baird family firmly rejected that characterization of their daughter. In October 2015, Mendoza entered a guilty plea to first-degree felony murder. Sentencing took place on November 10, 2015, before Judge Joseph Bean in Utah. She received 16 years to life in prison, with parole eligibility expected around 2039. She was 23 years old when the sentence was handed down. In her statement to the court, Mendoza said 3 words that were repeated in every account of the proceedings. "I'm the monster here." The Baird family's response made clear that the acknowledgement brought no relief. Tawny's father, Casey Baird, said openly that he had not known the full extent of the danger his daughter had been living inside for years, and he vowed to appear at every future parole hearing to ensure Mendoza remained imprisoned for as long as the system could be persuaded to hold her. The case did not fully leave public attention after sentencing. Reports emerged that content connected to Mendoza had appeared on social media platforms, including what was described as prison-generated TikTok activity. Corrections officials intervened and addressed the situation. The episode drew significant criticism and became part of a wider conversation about digital access within correctional facilities, though the focal point of that conversation, in this instance, was a woman who had killed her partner on an interstate and was serving a life sentence. What this case also represented, and what those close to it said deserved more attention than it received, was the specific reality of intimate partner violence inside same-sex relationships. The warning signs that surrounded Victoria and Tawny's 5-year relationship had been visible. The injuries had existed. The confrontations had occurred in proximity to people who loved them both. And the pattern had been minimized, explained away, or simply not understood as clearly dangerous until it was not possible to understand it any other way. Tawny Baird was 21 years old. She had walked into a behavioral health facility at 17 and taken responsibility for something that was not hers to carry, because she did not want older friends to face consequences. Something about that quality, absorbing what others could not bear, seems to have remained part of who she was through 5 years of a relationship that, in the end, asked far more of her than any person should ever be expected to give. Case 4. Mia Bailey. On the evening of June 18, 2024, Mia Bailey entered her parents' home without permission, opened fire on both of them, and then discharged her firearm through a locked bedroom door where her brother and his wife were sheltering, leaving 2 people dead before she fled the scene in a yellow vehicle. Mia Bailey was 29 years old when the crime was committed in Washington City. Utah woman Joseph Bailey, 70, and Gail Bailey, 69, 2 parents who had devoted decades of their lives to raising 4 children, one of whom would end their lives on that same June evening. How did things escalate this far? Let's break it down step by step. Mia Bailey was born Colin Troy Bailey and legally changed her name and gender in 2023. From the age of 4, she had carried diagnoses that multiplied over the years: autism, ADHD, OCD, psychosis, and schizophrenia. Her brothers later described a childhood and young adulthood shaped by escalating psychiatric crises and repeated encounters with services that provided temporary stabilization without lasting foundation. The family had navigated years of hospitalizations, treatment programs, and crisis interventions that addressed immediate episodes, but could not resolve the underlying conditions. Prior protective order proceedings had involved Bailey and various family members. Her brother Corey's son, known as Corey, had been part of those proceedings. Tensions within the family had accumulated over years of managing a sibling whose illness required constant, complex attention. Bailey had no prior criminal history, according to her defense. What she had was a long record of untreated crisis and a family relationship fractured by years of exhausting, unresolved conflict. In the days immediately before June 18, 2024, Bailey's psychological state deteriorated significantly. She sought help voluntarily. She was assessed, held briefly, and discharged while family members later described her as still exhibiting serious symptoms. What she told investigators after her arrest was stark and direct. She said she had gone to the house intending to harm her parents. She said she hated them. She said she would do it again. Those words appeared in virtually every news report that covered the case. Whether they reflected a fixed belief, a delusional state, or something in between is something her attorney argued at sentencing, though the argument did not alter the outcome, and it was not meant to eliminate accountability. It was meant, rather, to describe what had been present when accountability became necessary. On the evening of June 18, 2024, Bailey entered her parents' home in Washington City without permission. Joseph Bailey, 70 years old, and Gail Bailey, 69, were inside. Corey and his wife were also present. Bailey opened fire. She shot her mother first. When her father moved toward the situation, she shot him as well. Both victims were struck multiple times. Both were pronounced dead at the scene. After they fell, Bailey descended to a lower level of the home. Corey and his wife had locked themselves in a bedroom upon hearing the sounds from upstairs. Bailey fired through the locked door. Corey managed to escape through a window. He reached a neighbor's home and called emergency services. His wife also escaped. Bailey fled in a yellow Kia Soul. She was located hours later in the nearby city of St. George. During a standoff with law enforcement, she briefly held a firearm to her own head before officers were able to take her into custody. In police interviews that followed her arrest, she reiterated that she had intended to harm her parents, expressed no remorse, and acknowledged that Corey had not been her primary target, though firing through a locked door while he was inside told a different story. She was charged with aggravated murder, attempted aggravated murder, aggravated burglary, and related firearm charges. The legal resolution came through a plea entered in November 2025. Bailey pleaded guilty and mentally ill to 2 counts of aggravated murder and 1 count of aggravated assault. Several additional charges were dismissed as part of the agreement. On December 19, 2025, Judge Barnes sentenced her to 2 consecutive 25 years to life terms for the murders and an additional 0 to 5 years for the assault. She was 30 years old at sentencing and was remanded immediately to the Utah State Prison. The sentencing hearing was emotionally layered in ways few proceedings managed to be. Both of Bailey's brothers, Corey, who had narrowly escaped through a bedroom window, and Dustin, gave victim impact statements. They described the particular anguish of losing parents and a sibling simultaneously. They acknowledged Mia's mental illness without using it to reduce what they were calling for. They supported the consecutive sentences as a matter of public safety. Their statements circulated widely because they contained a quality rarely found in such proceedings: the ability to hold grief for everyone who was lost, including the person responsible. A handwritten note from Bailey to the judge was submitted before sentencing. It expressed sorrow. Its sincerity was left for each reader to interpret. Joseph Bailey and Gail Bailey raised 4 children. One of them ended their lives on a June evening in Washington City. Another escaped through a window and called for help. A third watched from a distance as a family was permanently altered by a single night. The mental health facility that discharged Mia Bailey days before those events did not intend for any of it. Intentions and outcomes in these situations are different things entirely. What those 3 surviving siblings now carry: grief for parents, grief for a sister serving consecutive life terms, and the weight of being the family this happened to, is something no sentencing document can fully account for. Case 5. Tracy Marie Grist. On the evening of July 12, 2024, Tracy Marie Grist allegedly turned her own home into a trap, luring her son-in-law across state lines under a carefully constructed pretext, positioning her own son inside to act, and then helping assemble a cover story in the minutes that followed the shooting of her son-in-law. Tracy Marie Grist was 58 years old when the crime was committed in American Fork, Utah. Tracy's son-in-law, Matthew Restelli, 42 years old, drove from California to Utah that evening genuinely believing he was picking up his wife and 2 young children for the ride home, and never made that drive. The extraordinary level of coordination and premeditation involved in this case made it extremely disturbing. What led to this moment wasn't sudden. It had been building for a long time. But to get the full story, let's walk through the timeline step by step. Tracy Marie Grist was 60 years old at the time of her conviction in April 2026. She had multiple marriages behind her and adult children who would all, in various ways, become central to the proceedings that followed. Her daughter, Catherine Restelli, had left her husband Matthew in California and traveled with their 2 young children to stay with Grist in American Fork, Utah, in the months before July 2024. Matthew Restelli was 42. The couple's marriage had been deteriorating for some time. Catherine described his behavior as volatile. She was looking for a way out of the relationship. Her mother, prosecutors argued, took that search and redirected it toward something no divorce attorney would ever recommend. According to trial testimony, including testimony from Catherine herself, who entered a plea and agreed to testify for the state, what began as dark humor about Matthew's behavior gradually shifted into something more deliberate. Catherine told the court her mother had proposed eliminating Matthew as the most direct resolution to the problem. She said Grist described luring Matthew to Utah under a believable pretext and staging what followed to look like self-defense. Catherine testified she had second thoughts. She said she wanted to withdraw. She claimed her mother told her the plan was proceeding regardless. The family had reportedly spent months using dark, desensitizing language about Matthew, referring to him by a nickname, making increasingly pointed remarks that turned the idea of harm into something familiar. Prosecutors argued That pattern was not accidental. It was preparation. Digital evidence was central to the state's case. Investigators found that Grist had researched a specific real-world case online, the murder of Florida law professor Dan Markel, in which a mother-in-law was alleged to have orchestrated the killing. Grist had apparently examined how that case was conceived and executed. Prosecutors presented those searches as evidence she had been looking for a template, not satisfying casual curiosity. They also presented evidence of an AirTag tracking device allegedly placed on Matthew's vehicle to monitor his location. The house was cleaned before Matthew's arrival. Prosecutors characterized that as an effort to reduce physical evidence. Access to a gun safe provided the means. An AirTag, a clean house, and a family that had been talking about this for months. The infrastructure, the prosecution argued, had been assembled deliberately. Matthew Rastelli arrived at the home on the evening of July 12, 2024, believing he was collecting his wife and children to drive back to California. A rental car complication involving Catherine's out-of-state license had been offered as the reason for his trip. Kevin Ellis, Grist's son, Catherine's brother, was inside the house when Matthew entered. Kevin shot Matthew multiple times. The autopsy described 7 gunshot wounds to vital areas of the body. Neighbors heard the shots in rapid succession. What followed is where the staging became central to the obstruction charges. A knife was placed in Matthew's right hand after the shooting. Forensic findings indicated it had been positioned post-mortem. Matthew was left-handed. Investigators traced the knife to a specific supplier, and correspondence linked it directly to Grist. The 911 call came approximately 8 minutes after a neighbor had already placed one. That gap formed a core element of the obstruction case. Grist's call told dispatchers Kevin had fired because Matthew had produced a knife. Kevin initially offered the same account to responding officers. What the physical evidence showed investigators was a different sequence entirely. Grist's trial in April 2026 featured a family testifying against itself in conditions that were painful in every direction. Catherine, operating under her plea agreement, described the evolution of the plot in detail. Kevin, convicted separately of the shooting, reportedly expressed regret in a recorded communication. Other family members described months of desensitizing language that had normalized the idea of harming Matthew. Grist took the stand and denied any planning. She attributed her online searches to casual interest in true crime media. She described the jokes as harmless venting. She said she froze in the chaos of what Kevin had done and did not think clearly about 911. The jury deliberated approximately 5 hours and returned guilty verdicts on all counts: murder, conspiracy to commit murder, obstruction, and related charges. Matthew Rastelli drove to Utah to pick up his children. He arrived at his mother-in-law's home, expecting a difficult conversation at the end of a difficult marriage. What was waiting was not a conversation. His 2 young children still exist. They are being raised now, in whatever arrangement followed the legal disintegration of everyone who surrounded them. What they will eventually come to understand about the night their father died, and who arranged it, and why, is not something any trial record will be able to fully resolve. Tracy Grist faces sentencing in June 2026. Kevin Ellis and Catherine Rastelli have each received separate terms. A family organized itself around a plan and then collapsed under the weight of everything it had set in motion. Case 6. Mary Nance Hansen. On the afternoon of January 29, 2010, a 70-year-old woman traveled by public rail across Salt Lake City, waited in a parking lot for nearly an hour, and then opened fire on her former daughter-in-law, a woman who had just finished her afternoon shift as a preschool teacher. This attack was carried out in broad daylight in front of witnesses, without hesitation. There is a category of family conflict that the legal system handles thousands of times each year: custody disputes, visitation disagreements, A grandparent losing meaningful contact with grandchildren they love. Courts intervening. Judges issuing orders. Attorneys filing motions. The machinery moving forward at the pace it moves at. Most of these disputes are painful and not dangerous. The people involved are angry, sometimes brokenhearted, but they remain within the system because that is where these conflicts are supposed to be fought. Mary Nance Hansen was 70 years old on January 29, 2010. She had a concealed carry permit. For years, she had watched her son, Dale Jankowski, fight a bitter custody battle with his ex-wife, and things were heading in a direction she simply could not accept. She had, by her own later admission, spent approximately 9 months trying to change the outcome through conversation. She had concluded it was not working. What she did that afternoon in a parking lot in Salt Lake City ended one woman's life, removed 2 children from the last parent they had, and sent Hansen herself to a Utah prison for whatever time she had remaining. The victim of this heartbreaking story, Tatiana Nikitina, was 34 years old, recently engaged to a new partner. Tatiana was planning to relocate with her children to Nevada for a fresh start when she stepped out of that building and walked toward her car for the very last time. But to understand what drove a 70-year-old grandmother to a parking lot with a loaded weapon, we need to go back to where it all began. Tatiana Nikitina, also called Tanya, moved from Ukraine to Utah. In 1999, she married Dale Jankowski, the son of Mary Nance Hansen. They had 2 children together. The marriage ended in divorce in 2005 after 7 years. What followed the divorce was a sustained and corrosive conflict involving Nikitina, Jankowski, and Hansen in ways that exceeded the bounds of ordinary post-divorce tension. Nikitina filed affidavits describing Hansen as controlling, verbally hostile, and overbearing. She accused Hansen of working to undermine her relationship with her own children. Court filings described specific incidents, including Hansen cutting off Nikitina's vehicle in traffic, causing a minor collision. Nikitina filed for protective orders against Jankowski after the marriage ended. She described years of pressure and interference from a former family unit that would not accept the conclusion the divorce was supposed to represent. By late 2009, the custody arrangement had shifted. A judge granted Nikitina physical custody of the 2 children, who were approximately 7 and 9 at the time. Nikitina was engaged to a man named Rod Hernandez. She was planning to relocate to Nevada following their wedding. That plan, specifically the planned move, became Hansen's central fixation. She believed, with a kind of conviction that did not leave room for other conclusions, that the children belonged with their father and with her. She later told the parole board she had spent 9 months trying to reason with Nikitina. She felt ignored. She felt she was watching grandchildren. She loved being removed from her life permanently. What those 9 months of frustration produced, in the end, was a decision no family court had authorized and no legal process would have permitted. Hansen traveled by TRAX, Salt Lake City's public light rail, to the area near the Salt Lake Community Action Program Head Start Preschool, where Nikitina worked as a preschool teacher on January 29, 2010. She arrived early. She waited approximately 45 minutes, positioning herself where she could observe the parking lot without drawing attention. Nikitina left the building with coworkers at the end of her shift and got into her car. She was on the phone with her fiancé, Rod Hernandez. She was speaking of love and anticipation for the weekend ahead. Hansen, armed with a .38 caliber revolver and wearing a gray hoodie, approached the vehicle on foot. She fired multiple times. Nikitina was struck 4 times in the head. The car moved a short distance before coming to rest against another vehicle in the lot. Hernandez heard screaming over the open phone line before the call went silent. Witnesses in the parking lot observed the attack. Hansen sat down on the curb afterward. She called her son. She then called emergency services. When responders asked why she had done what she did, she said she did not know, and that was all she intended to say. She was identified and arrested the same day. held on $1 million bail. She cooperated with the process that followed without providing much elaboration. Police searched Jankowski's residence, but found no evidence linking him to the plan. He was never charged. On August 19, 2010, she pleaded guilty to first-degree felony murder. Sentencing was set for October 22nd. The hearing before Judge Dino Jimenez included something observers were not prepared for. Hansen stated in court that she wanted to be sentenced to death. She requested execution by lethal injection and asked to be transferred to prison immediately. When informed that the case did not meet Utah's statutory criteria for a capital sentence, she responded with words that Rod Hernandez, seated in that courtroom, never forgot. She said she supposed she had not done a good enough job. The room registered what had just been said. Hernandez struggled visibly. He later called her a monster and described what he hoped would happen to her in a Utah prison, words this documentary will not repeat, but that anyone present said stayed in the room long after they were spoken. Hansen received 15 years to life. She declined to address the court further. At a parole board appearance in 2020, Hansen spoke publicly about her actions for the first time since her arrest. She described her motive as protection of her grandchildren. She attributed the act in part to satanic influence, a claim that generated both news coverage and considerable skepticism. She was denied parole. She has lost contact with her son and with the grandchildren whose custody she murdered to influence. They were sent to live with Nikitina's family following her death. Tanya Nikitina was 34 years old. She had built a life in a country not her own. She was engaged to someone who loved her deeply. She was, by every account, planning a future. None of it survived a Wednesday afternoon shift at a preschool in Salt Lake City, where she had spent her working days helping young children learn. Case 7. Nicole Terry Lester. On the evening of December 31, 2019, a 29-year-old West Valley City mother took her 4-year-old daughter to a room in the basement of their home and ended her life. Then walked calmly to a neighbor's front door, borrowed their phone, and told emergency services to come and arrest her. In the weeks leading up to this crime, Nicole Lester was typing questions into a search engine. Not the kinds of questions most people ask in December, about travel plans or seasonal logistics, or what to do when a relative arrives unexpectedly. The questions investigators later recovered from her phone were about the mechanics of causing serious physical harm to a child, about specific injuries, about anatomical structures in a young child's chest, about methods of applying force with serious intent. The search history, introduced in charging documents, described someone spending time in the weeks before New Year's Eve researching precisely how to hurt a small person. Nicole Terry Lester was 29 years old. Her daughter, Lainey Voss, was 4. Her son, who was 6, was upstairs. On the last evening of 2019, Lainey Voss died in the basement of their West Valley City home. This case had a deeply troubling evidence of premeditation that investigators uncovered before a single charge was filed. And what made it shocking to most people who looked into the case was the unsettling calm with which Nicole Terry Lester surrendered herself immediately after. This case raises more questions than answers, and we are about to uncover every one of them. Nicole Lester had a prior criminal history, though nothing in it forecasted what December 2019 would contain. Records showed a drug possession charge from 2012, later dismissed after probation. There were assault and domestic violence-related charges from 2013 and 2014. None of those entries prepared anyone, neighbors, investigators, or the legal system, for the search history or what followed it. The guilty but mentally ill plea she entered in 2022 acknowledged that something had been significantly and acutely wrong with her mental state, wrong enough that a diagnosed illness had materially impaired her capacity, though not to a degree that removed her legal responsibility under Utah law. What the phone record established, more than anything else in the public documents, was premeditation. The searches were specific. They were purposeful. They described someone who had been thinking about what she planned to do before she did it. A person does not ask those questions by accident. A parent does not search those terms out of idle curiosity. The searches appeared in charging documents alongside the physical evidence and the confession that followed the crime, and they were treated by investigators and prosecutors as one of the most unambiguous elements of the evidentiary record. If the physical evidence showed what had happened, the phone showed that it had been considered in advance. On the evening of December 31, 2019, Lester took her 4-year-old daughter Lainey to a small room in the basement of their home. She used a ceramic kitchen knife. Autopsy findings recorded more than 30 individual injuries from the blade. Among those injuries were defensive wounds to Lainey's arms, hands, and shoulders. Physical evidence that the child had tried to protect herself during the attack. Deep lacerations to the chest cavity reached the heart, the lungs, and the spine. A ceramic kitchen knife was recovered at the scene. The medical examiner's findings were, by the accounts of everyone who encountered them, among the most difficult elements of the case to process. After the attack, Lester left the basement. She walked out of the house. She went to a neighbor's front door and asked to borrow a phone. She made calls, including to emergency services, and told her neighbor she had just harmed her daughter and needed to be arrested. She waited outside. When officers arrived, she told them she needed to be taken into custody. She cooperated immediately. She did not attempt to flee or provide a false account of what had occurred. Her 6-year-old son was found upstairs, asleep, unharmed. He was later placed in the care of Lester's mother. The contrast between the calm cooperation that followed and the phone searches that preceded everything is the part of this case that observers who covered it found most difficult to set aside. Someone had spent weeks formulating questions about how to seriously harm a child. A 4-year-old had spent the last moments of her life trying to defend herself. And then the person responsible had walked to a neighbor's house, borrowed a phone, and told emergency services to come and arrest her, as though surrender had always been the final step in a sequence she had planned through from the beginning. What happens in the space between those two facts is not something the court record resolves. Lester was initially charged with aggravated murder, a charge that under Utah law carried potential capital sentencing. In February 2022, she entered a plea of guilty but mentally ill. The structure of that plea acknowledged the crime while recognizing that a diagnosed mental illness had substantially impaired her at the time of the act, not to a degree constituting full legal insanity, but enough to affect the sentencing framework available to the court. She was sentenced on August 3, 2022, to 25 years to life at the Utah State Prison. She was not sentenced to death. She began serving her sentence immediately. Lainey Voss was 4 years old. She had a 6-year-old brother sleeping upstairs. She had a grandmother who later took custody of that brother. She had a mother who spent weeks researching something and then did it, and then walked outside and asked to be arrested. What Lainey's 4 years of life contained, what she laughed at, what frightened her, what she was curious about, what she might have grown into, is not in any document this case produced. What is in the record is a search history, a knife, an autopsy, a sentence, and a brother now being raised in someone else's home. That is what the law had to work with. It was not enough. It was just what there was. Case 8. Melissa Johnson Fawcett. On the night of January 6, 2024, a 56-year-old Provo woman shot her husband 4 times using 2 separate firearms. And when investigators arrived at the scene, they found not only a man dead in his hallway, but a second gun hidden beneath clothing in a purse, and an explanation for the blood on it that DNA testing would prove was entirely false. When someone contacts emergency services after a domestic incident and claims self-defense, investigators do not receive that account as settled fact. They document injuries or the absence of them. They map the scene. They note what is present and what is notably absent. They examine the position of the body, the trajectory of each shot, the physical relationship between everyone involved and the space around them. This is standard practice precisely because the gap between what people say happened and what the physical evidence demonstrates is sometimes significant. In the early hours of January 6, 2024, Melissa Johnson Fawcett called emergency services from the Northwest Provo home she shared with her husband, Corey Fawcett. She told the dispatcher her husband had attacked her and that she had responded in self-defense. Corey Fawcett was 55 years old. He was in the hallway. He was deceased. The officers who arrived began the standard process of documenting what had occurred. What the evidence told them and what Melissa had told the dispatcher were not the same account. At first glance, it seems like a straightforward account of fear and survival. But this case is anything but simple. Let's dive into what really happened. Melissa Johnson Fawcett was 56 years old on the night Corey died. The couple had been together for a significant period. The full history of their marriage was never aired in a courtroom because the case resolved through a guilty plea in April 2026, just days before a scheduled trial date of May 6th. What Melissa told investigators on the night of the incident was this. Corey had entered the bedroom while she was in bed, grabbed her by the neck, and struck her on the head. She said he had previously made threats against her life. She said she feared he was about to retrieve a weapon from elsewhere in the house. She retrieved a handgun from beside her on the bed. She fired. That account, standing on its own, described a frightened woman responding to an immediate threat in the only way available to her. What investigators found as they examined the scene introduced complications the self-defense account could not absorb. Corey Fawcett was shot 4 times. The first shot came from the gun Melissa had identified, the one from the bed. But 3 additional shots, all delivered to the head, came from a second handgun. That second firearm was found concealed in a purse beneath clothing in the bedroom. Melissa had not disclosed it to the dispatcher. When investigators located the gun and asked about it, she said it was essentially non-functional and that any biological material found on it had come from a rabbit hunting trip in the desert. DNA testing was conducted on the material. The result directly contradicted her explanation. The biological material on the second gun matched Corey Fawcett. Forensic examination of the location where Corey fell introduced further problems. Physical evidence at that site indicated that at least one of the 3 headshots had been fired downward, at close range, toward someone already on the floor. The pattern of damage to the floor beneath his body supported that reconstruction. Investigators noted there was no ongoing movement by the victim at that point that could have constituted a continued threat. There were also no documented injuries on Melissa consistent with the assault she described. No marks on her neck, no bruising on her head. For investigators, each of these findings compounded the others. A hidden second gun. A false explanation for its condition. A forensic reconstruction inconsistent with the narrative. The cumulative picture, prosecutors argued, was not one of self-defense. She was arrested and charged initially with first-degree murder. An obstruction of justice charge was added after investigators concluded she had deliberately concealed the second firearm and provided a demonstrably false account of how blood had come to be on it. The case was transferred early from Utah County to Wasatch County due to a judicial conflict. It moved through pretrial proceedings without major controversy, though the forensic foundation was one that observers noted would be difficult to address at trial without successfully challenging the physical science. That challenge, in the end, never happened in a courtroom. On approximately April 15, 2026, Melissa Johnson Fawcett entered a guilty plea. She pleaded guilty to second-degree murder, a reduction from the original first-degree charge, along with felony discharge of a firearm causing serious injury and obstruction of justice. Court filings described the reduction as being in the interest of justice. As part of the agreement, she did not contest the possibility of consecutive sentencing. The minimum exposure under the terms of the plea was approximately 8 years, with a potential life sentence depending on the court structure at sentencing, which was scheduled for May 26, 2026. The self-defense framework is one of the most important protections available in the legal system. It exists because genuine threats occur and people do have the right to protect themselves. It is also, for those reasons, one of the claims that investigators and prosecutors examine most carefully when it does not align with the physical evidence. In this case, the physical evidence described a second gun retrieved from a hiding place, a fatal sequence that continued after threat had ended, a false account of blood that DNA testing contradicted, and a lack of injury on the person claiming to have been attacked. The law evaluated each of those elements. Corey Fawcett was 55 years old when he died in the hallway of his Provo home. Whatever the full history of that marriage contained is not in the public record. What the forensic record established is: Melissa Johnson Fawcett awaits sentencing. The rabbit hunting explanation is part of the court file. Corey Fawcett is not here to offer his account of any of it. Thank you for watching.